On a quiet day in July 2024, Joe Dirt vanished, and his story of courage and survival began. What may seem like the tale of just one small dog is a much bigger story, one that touches the hearts of everyone who knows the horror of puppy mills and the resilience of animals. This is the story of little Joe Dirt, his battle for trust and love, and his journey of healing. But it's also the story of how we can fight to end the suffering caused by puppy mills. Joe Dirt went missing on July 12, 2024, from a campground in the mountains near Nakusp. Like many others, I saw the post on Facebook, a call for help to find this tiny, terrified dog. I assumed, like most people would, that his owner was close by, combing through the forest to bring Joe home. But a week later, I got a call to the dog control line from an employee of the hot springs. She reported seeing a small dog fitting Joe's description, wandering along the road. It broke my heart to hear that Joe was still out there, alone and scared. Joe is just a 10-pound terrier mix, lost in a vast wilderness filled with dangers. I couldn't stand the thought of Joe out there, so I drove up the mountain, searching through thick trees, looking for any sign of him. Hours passed, and all I found were small traces, dog droppings, a tiny trail in the grass where he might have passed. As night fell, I had to leave, but my mind couldn't rest. I got the owner's contact number from the hot springs staff and called him that night. When I spoke to Joe's owner, my heart sank. He told me he had only adopted Joe 2 weeks before. Joe was from the Edmonton SPCA, where he'd been brought after being rescued from a puppy mill, along with many others. He didn't know his name, didn't know how to play, didn't know what a toy was. Everything scared him. He didn't even know how to bark. This is the tragic reality of dogs in puppy mills. They are born and raised in cramped, dirty cages, treated as nothing more than products. They don't know love, safety, or comfort. And little Joe Dirt was one of them. He lived in that environment for the first 5 years of his life. He didn't know that the world outside could be different. To him, everyone, even his new owner, was a potential threat. With that news, I knew that bringing Joe home would be a challenge. He wouldn't respond to food, toys, or his name. We had to gain his trust. I brought out a crate, blanket, food, and water to set up a feeding station. The owner drove back from Edmonton to help. We did have Joe come into the crate regularly for food, but the slightest noise or movement would send him bolting back into the forest. For days we tried everything to lure Joe in, to make him feel safe enough to approach us. But he didn't have a bond with his new owner. With each attempt, Joe moved further away from our feeding station, deeper into the trees, into new areas. His owner had to leave again, and that's when he decided to surrender ownership. Joe was now officially under dog control jurisdiction, if we could catch him. I set up a live animal trap in an area where campers had reported sightings. Every day I drove up the mountain 1 to 3 times to check on it, bringing treats like chicken fingers, rotisserie chicken, wet cat food. But Joe wouldn't go near it. Only once he managed to steal the blanket off the top of the trap and disappear into the woods. As the days turned into weeks, the heat wave hit, record highs. Wildfires erupted across the Kootenays. The smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe, and Joe was still out there. My worry grew stronger every day, and then I learned that other campers had been leaving food for Joe. While it was a relief to know he wasn't starving, it also meant he wouldn't come near the live trap. We had a lot of close encounters. Joe would come into sight, but would vanish as soon as he spotted us. He'd watch from a distance, studying every move we made. It was a game of patience and persistence, and I was determined not to give up on him. After talking to the hot springs staff, they agreed to block off a camping spot for 5 days. I set up another feeding station and parked my car nearby. Day after day, I sat quietly, leaving food, gradually moving it closer and closer to where I parked my car. And then one day, there he was, 6 feet away, cautiously sniffing at the hot dogs I'd left him. It was the closest we'd gotten in over a month. But little Joe is clever. He grabbed that bowl and dashed off, taking his meal to go. Meals on wheels. I had to laugh at his wit and resilience, but every day I felt a little closer. I felt a growing admiration for this tiny survivor. On August 22nd, with my friend Florence from Pals by my side, I set up a trail of hot dog pieces leading to my car. Holding my breath, I watched as Joe approached. This time, I was ready. I had a net in hand, and as Joe reached for the last piece of hot dog, I closed the net. Florence held the trembling Joe as we made our way back down the mountain. In that moment, it wasn't relief I felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude that he was safe, gratitude that his journey was finally over. After 42 days lost in the woods, alone, this little fella would not have to fight for his life anymore. When little Joe finally arrived in my home, I thought that maybe, finally, he'd find a little peace. But that first night, as I watched him lie on his bed, it became painfully clear how deeply scarred he was. Joe didn't feel safe. He didn't know he was home. He shook at every noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floor, even the distant sound of the wind outside. Each little sound was like a shock wave of terror that sent him cowering back into himself. I sat near him, silently offering my presence, hoping he'd sense that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. But he wouldn't come near me. Joe had no idea what it felt like to be safe, to trust someone, or even to experience simple comfort. Florence from Prowls brought over a little dog bed for Joe. I placed that on the regular bed I kept in my office, which is an open space I can see from anywhere in the house. I then corralled the area so that my 2 Irish wolfhounds wouldn't bother him. For days, Joe barely left his spot. I set up his food and water close by, hoping he'd feel comfortable enough to eat. But he only nibbled at his food when I was nowhere around. I quickly learned that any attempt to approach him, even just to pick him up, was a mistake. His entire body would tense, his eyes wide with panic, and in an instant he'd be gone, retreating to some far corner of the room or hiding under furniture. Cornering him was out of the question. He'd only grow more fearful. Joe was also not house-trained. It wasn't his fault. The poor little guy had never known what it meant to have a safe, clean place to live. In that puppy mill cage, he had no choice but to sleep, eat, and relieve himself, all in the same filthy space. The thought of this broke my heart. Joe didn't know that he could have something better, something clean. I knew it would take time, but I didn't mind. I cleaned up his messes without a word, careful not to frighten him further. I was determined to give him that better life, to show him that there was kindness in the world, even if he wasn't ready to trust it yet. Then on a day, my grandkids came to visit. The moment they stepped into the house, Joe's fear took over again. He started shaking uncontrollably, his eyes darting around, desperate for an escape. He retreated back to his bed. On the bed, the only place he felt remotely safe. To him, my grandkids, so full of joy and energy, must have seemed terrifying, even though they were simply being kids. It was painful to see Joe like this. He was missing out on the love and warmth that my family would have happily shared with him. But his past left him unable to let his guard down. From that day on, we made sure the kids gave him space and kept their voices low around him. They learned to adapt their play to help Joe feel safe, to understand that he wasn't like any other dogs they knew. In Joe's world, there was no friendly hands or reassuring voices, only survival. His trust had been shattered. But he was beginning, little by little, to accept that this was his space. I'd watch him, hoping he'd understand that he didn't have to hide anymore, that he had a home, that he had people who cared. Every day was a slow, delicate process. Days turned into weeks, and slowly he did begin to change. Joe would sometimes watch me from a distance as I moved around the house, observing, his eyes softer, but still wary. Once in a while he'd venture just a few feet from his bed. It was almost like he was testing the waters, finding out if he could feel safe. I decided to try giving Joe a small, soft, stuffed lamb as a comfort item. I didn't know if he'd accept it, but I thought it might give him something to hold on to, a little source of comfort. And from that moment on, I placed the lamb on his bed. It became his one constant companion. That little lamb became his security, his emotional support pet, if you will. Every time I saw him curled up with it, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Joe was beginning to feel just the faintest hint of comfort. And then something miraculous happened. I received a call from pals about another dog in desperate need, a little senior Bichon Frise cross named Daisy. She had a terrible bladder stone and whose owners could no longer care for her. I thought, why not? Maybe a friend his size would be just what Joe needed. The first time Joe and Daisy met, I saw something change in him. Daisy was calm, gentle, but just as fragile as Joe in her own way. They had an unspoken understanding from the start. She wasn't scared or intimidated by his nervousness. Instead, she offered him companionship without asking for anything in return. With Daisy, Joe finally found someone who could show him what it meant to be a dog. She taught him how to play, how to share his space, and little by little he began to open up. For the first time ever, I saw Joe get the zoomies, a burst of joy that had been holding back for so long. Watching them, I laughed, I cried, overwhelmed by the change in him. My little Joe Dirt, the dog who had spent his life in fear, was learning what happiness felt like. Joe still has a long way to go. He's still very wary of strangers, and the sound of children's laughter is still a bit too much for him. But when I see him lying beside Daisy or coming up to me with trust in his eyes, I know we're on the right path. He's healing step by step with Daisy by his side. Joe's journey has been one of courage and resilience. From a tiny, trembling dog who knew only fear, he's transformed into a soul willing to love and to trust, to find joy in life. His story is a reminder of the horrors animals endure in puppy mills and the powerful healing that can come when they're given a second chance. Joe's story is just one example of the unimaginable cruelty that happens every day in puppy mills. These mills are facilities where animals like Joe are bred in shocking conditions solely for profit. They're overcrowded, filthy, and often lack basic necessities like food, water, or medical care. These innocent dogs spend their lives confined to tiny cages with no space to run, play, or feel the warmth of human love. Puppy mill operators see these animals as commodities, breeding them repeatedly until their little bodies are broken. They're left with deep physical and emotional scars that can take years to heal, if they're lucky enough to be rescued at all. Dogs like Joe, taken from their mothers too soon, lack socialization and can suffer from chronic health issues and severe behavioral problems due to their traumatic early experiences. We are asking the British Columbia government to take a stand. This petition is a call to end the inhumane practices of puppy mills and backyard breeders in our province. We want legislation that makes it illegal to breed dogs in these horrific conditions, with strict penalties and enforcement to protect the lives of innocent animals. We're demanding several crucial measures. 1. Mandatory licensing and inspections for breeders. All breeders should require licensing and regular inspections to ensure humane practices, adequate space, and proper care for every animal in their care. Strict penalties for violations. Those who violate these standards should face serious consequences, including heavy fines, lifetime bans from owning or breeding, and even jail time for severe abuse and neglect. 3. Public education campaigns. Awareness campaigns are essential to help people recognize the difference between reputable breeders, puppy mills, backyard breeders, to encourage adoption from shelters and rescues, and to build a culture of responsible, compassionate pet ownership. 4. Support for rescue organizations. Increased funding and resources for animal rescue organizations like PALS, which work tirelessly to rehabilitate dogs like Joe and give them a chance to find loving homes. This petition is our opportunity to give a voice to animals like Joe, who have endured enough suffering. By signing, you're standing up for humane treatment, compassion, and a future where no dog has to suffer the way Joe did. We need your support, not just for Joe, but for every dog trapped in these conditions, waiting for someone to care. Join us in ending puppy mills and backyard breeding. Sign the petition, support PALS, and help us to continue the work of rescuing and healing these animals. Joe has come a long way, but there are so many more like him. Together, we can make sure they all get the second chance they deserve. Today, you have the power to change the future for dogs like Joe. By signing our petition, you're standing up against puppy mills. You're demanding accountability and an end to cruelty. Joe's journey has made this possible. Thank you for being a part of Joe's journey and for helping build a kinder world for all animals.
We're guys. We keep a little dirt under my pillow for the dirt man, in case he comes to town. What? Keep a little dirt under my pillow for the dirt man, so he won't take me down.
I've never done this before, you know that, right? After they laughed, it was like, no, you let those little fuckers in the house. I don't trust you. I guess I can't say that, can I?
No, we were recording.
You want me to be me?
So he won't take me down to his lair deep under the mountain. What are you talking about?
Opening shot, soft. No, I know. I know. Okay. Narrator. Gentle but somber tone.